Majority Leader Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move the House resolve itself into the Committee of the Whole for the consideration of business on second reading.
All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The ayes have it. Members of the committee have before you for your consideration House Bill 404. The clerk will read the title of the bill.
Mr. Chair, House Bill 404, introduced by Deming, a bill for an act entitled An Act Creating the Defend the Guard Act, requiring an official congressional declaration or action to release the Montana National Guard to active combat duty, providing powers of the governor regarding the Montana National Guard, providing definitions, and providing an immediate effective date. Mr. Chair.
What is your pleasure, Representative Deming?
Mr. Speaker, I move that when this committee does rise and report after having under consideration House Bill 404 that it recommend the same do pass.
Representative Deming.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate this opportunity. The purpose of this bill is to require that the U.S. Constitution be followed, particularly with regard to sending our National Guard into combat overseas. This bill was co-sponsored by almost a third of the legislature. To oppose this bill is to declare that you don't follow the Constitution or the rule of law, that you couldn't care less about the physical and mental devastation America's wars of choice have wrought in this state. National Guardsmen have said that they want to fight terror. What do they think is happening here in America? And which more directly affects our people in this state at this time? If you vote against this bill and you represent coal country, remember to tell your constituents that the government that sends our men and women to their deaths in undeclared wars is the same government.
Representative, there would be no indication or do not imply anybody's motives on the floor.
You shouldn't want our National Guard sent overseas when there is so much to do here. For instance, let's help our Native brothers and sisters with the devastation visited upon their tribal lands by drug and human traffickers. Look at new Section 4, sub D. I put that section in for you specifically. After talks with the representative in seat 49 and hearing a session and a half of horror stories about drug trafficking in Indian country, deliberately targeting your communities, I thought, why send our Guard overseas when there's such a need here, especially in Indian country? There is a fiscal note, and I urge you to look at it. You will see that the fiscal note is based on completely fabricated assumptions. The federal structure, where we have 3 branches of government, where one branch does the appropriations, the federal structure, federal law, and common sense prevent the loss of funding and equipment. But let's say that the fiscal note is correct. How much does the treatment of the mental and physical health problems suffered by our veterans cost the state? The devastation created by deploying our forces into foreign conflicts with no goal and no end brings immense costs borne first by our National Guard, then our other constituents, and then we must try in the legislature to mitigate those costs. Remember that devastation is generational, and so that cost compounds. What the fiscal note assumes is that the Department of Defense can actually withhold resources in punishment for state policy decisions. The legislative branch, not the executive branch, controls federal spending. The Impoundment Control Act of 1974 prohibits the executive branch from withholding funds appropriated by Congress unless Congress specifically authorizes it. And I would ask you to reflect for a moment on where those federal dollars come from. So they're going to take money from us that they have already taken from us? There was a legal note. How does this bill trigger a legal note when all it is asking is that the federal government follow the Constitution?
1 minute.
Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 grants Congress, not the President, the power to declare war. Once war is declared, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, the President shall be the Commander-in-Chief and can call out the militia to do three things, found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. And who is threatening to take away the resources that our National Guard depends on? I asked in the committee for the names, ranks, and titles of all those making those threats. I haven't heard back. If I get them, I'll pass them along to the Secretary of Defense and both of our U.S. senators. I don't have helicopters to give you rides to convince you to vote for this bill. I wonder what those helicopter rides cost, as long as we're looking at costs.
Representative, your time has expired. Discussion on the bill. Representative G. Nikolakakos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot to say here. I'm not sure where to start, but I do want to first off dispel the false notion that Montana National Guardsmen are somehow victims, because they're not. They have agency. They're smart. We all knew what we did when we signed up. We raised our hand and took that oath. So I'm not sure, why an all-volunteer force, needs defending. I deployed countless times, and I deployed a lot of guys and gals too. And in my career, both active duty and in the National Guard, I saw a lot of fighting over who got to go. And personally, although I've been in circles where there's been a time where somebody didn't want to go, it's never happened to me. I've had to break up a lot of fights over a bunch of guys who wanted to go, and we didn't have enough seats. So again, this idea somehow that we're sending our boys and girls overseas to die when they don't want to go is just a false notion. So I think also people need to understand what the Montana National Guard is. And we had this bill last time. I talked to a lot of folks who didn't really even understand what it is. And so I think a lot of what's been happening with the helicopter rides is just education. People need to understand that we have a National Guard, not a state guard. There are states that have state guards fully funded and fully controlled by the state and the governor. We have a National Guard which has a dual federal and state mission. We get most of our training and funding from the federal government. We take our oath, and everything that we do is basically interchangeable and integral to our national defense. So when I deployed as an intelligence analyst, I would work interchangeably with our active duty counterparts. And we would step into each other's positions, and there was no way that really an outsider would tell the difference between us. And the National Guard forms an integral part of our national security. Without the National Guard, we'd be taking away a significant portion of our fighting force, and that's really what this bill threatens to do. Great Falls hosts the 120th Air Wing. It's 1,000 Air National Guardsmen. Many hundreds of them live in my district, or in the districts around me as well. I know them. I've served with these guys up until a couple years ago and just spoke to them at a leadership conference here a couple weeks ago. They were deeply concerned about this bill. It was the #1 issue that came up from the Guardsmen, and they're in a difficult position because it's hard to be able to talk about things when you wear a uniform, and you have to balance the line between what you're allowed to say while wearing that uniform. So again, you might think that giving, and I get what the message that's trying to be sent here. I get it. I appreciate it. And so you might think that giving a middle finger to the feds just sends a good message, right? But there's real consequences. When I was at the 120th Air Wing, one thing that we really fought to do was to get the upgrade to J models. There was 8 states competing with C-130s to get this upgrade. Only 5 are going to get it. And if we had 3, if we didn't get those upgrades, those 3 states were going to lose their entire mission. That means there would be no flying mission in Great Falls. We had to put on a full court press and tell the DOD and tell the National Guard Bureau, hey, this is why Montana is great. This is why we're awesome for this mission. This is why we're perfect to do this. And then we fought to get a medevac mission to increase, our capacity, which would also help us at the state level to, give us more capacity at the state level. So we are doing a full court press, around the country, showing that Montana and Great Falls, in this case, is great for the DOD. It's great for the NGB. But when we say that we're going to take federal training and federal funding, but we're not going to fulfill our federal mission, clearly we're going to put ourselves at a disadvantage. So this message alone is dangerous in the sense that we could we are genuinely risking defunding our Guard, which is not just a little phrase that we're saying it. We're putting our folks who are arguing for this for expansion and maintaining our missions in a really precarious spot. And again, I just hope that we make decisions at the right level. That's what we really need to remember. There is a good case to be made for Congress to do its job, absolutely. But what I always say is that if a general is making a decision that a sergeant should be making in the field, you're in trouble. And if a sergeant is making a decision that the general should be making behind the lines, then you're in trouble. So this is a battle that needs to be fought in Congress as far as the declaration of war goes. This is not something that we should impose upon ourselves. I really do believe that a green vote here is a vote to defund our Montana National Guard, and I strongly urge a red vote.
Representative Kometz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is a privilege for me to speak on this bill. And when you read a document like the bill, we all read different things into it, and I just read a sentence that makes so much sense to me, and that sentence just says that it will take a formal declaration of war before we deployed troops to a foreign field of war. And when I was in high school, I was on the wrestling team, and a lot of my older classmates went to Vietnam. And I guess that was my first exposure to a proxy war. And I saw those young men when they came home, and I did not recognize them. It was shocking to me what had happened to them in the year and a half or two they were actually deployed. And I've watched this process now over the years. I think we have had over 20 proxy wars in all parts of the world where our Congress does not declare war. I just wrote down a couple things. Do you know these 4 words? I used them the other day. Weapons of mass destruction. Do you know those 4 words cost us 4,500 American lives in an undeclared war? And we never did find the weapons of mass destruction. And, have you heard these words? We're going to prevent communist expansion. Do you know those words cost us over 50,000 American lives? And there's been more Vietnam veterans commit suicide than died in service. So I am a very strong proponent of this bill for that reason, that we have to just quit being involved in these proxy wars. Thank you for listening.
Representative Fox.
Mr. Speaker, speak to the bill.
Representative.
Mr. Speaker, body, I've spent 21 years in the National Guard. I commanded 3 different units up along the High Line. I spent 4 years active duty in the Coast Guard. The vast majority of the people that I've talked to oppose this bill. And as one of the other speakers said, when we start deploying people, usually we get a line of folks that want to go, and they'd probably quit the National Guard and go active duty if they had to. When you join the National Guard, you sign on a line just like every other military person that decides to go that route. And you fully expect to go at one point or the other. So please vote red on us. Thank you.
Representative C. Hinkle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll speak to the bill. Opponents of Defend the Guard legislation often claim that enacting such laws would result in the federal government defunding the state's National Guard as a punitive measure. This argument, however, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of federal appropriations law, statutory protections, and constitutional constraints governing military funding. Number 1, the federal government cannot arbitrarily defend states' National Guard. The power of the purse belongs to Congress, not the executive. The U.S. Constitution firmly places control of all federal spending in the hands of Congress, not the President or the Department of Defense. In Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, known as the Appropriation Clause, and it states, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in the consequence of appropriations made by law. This means that the executive branch lacks unilateral authority to withhold or relocate funds Congress has appropriated. If the federal government attempted to punish a state for enacting Defend the Guard by cutting funding, it would be in clear violation of the Impound Control Act of 1974, 31 U.S. Code 1511 through 1519, which prohibits the executive branch from withholding funds appropriated by Congress unless Congress explicitly authorizes such action. The DoD cannot legally defund a state's National Guard simply because a state passes a law limiting deployments to undeclared wars. Title 32 funding is mandated by federal law and cannot be withheld arbitrarily. 2, key statutes that protect the National Guard from funding from political retaliation. 32 U.S. Code 101 defines National Guard as a component both of state and federal military framework. 32 U.S. Code 104 establishes a federal-state compact that guarantees funding for state guard units unless a state fails to meet training or organizational requirements. 32 U.S. Code 108 outlines with specific conditions in which the National Guard funding could be withheld, which strictly related to compliance with training and readiness standards, not state policy decisions. 32 U.S. Code 109 clarifies the dual role of the National Guard as both a state and federal entity, further protecting its funding from arbitrary revocation. Since Defend the Guard does not interfere with federally mandated training, readiness, or organization, it does not meet the criteria on which federal government can lawfully cut funding under 32 U.S. Code 108. Number 3, why 32 U.S. Code 108 cannot be used to justify defunding the state's guard. A frequent but erroneous claim made by opponents of Defend the Guard is that 32 U.S. Code 108 provides the federal government with a mechanism to defund the state's National Guard if the state refuses to comply with Title 10 mobilization orders. However, a close reading of the statute demonstrates that this argument is legally unfounded. The statute states, if within the time to be fixed by the President or state or territory of Puerto Rico fails to comply with any requirements of this title, the National Guard of that jurisdiction should be barred from receiving any federal funds until compliance is achieved. So here's the analysis. That statute applies only when a state fails to meet Title 32 requirements related to training, organization, and readiness. It does not allow the federal government to defund the National Guard unit due to disagreements over Title 10 deployment decision, which govern combat deployments. A state's decision not to deploy troops under Title 10 without congressional declaration of war does not constitute noncompliance under Title 32. Defend the Guard legislation does not impede federally mandated training or drills, prevent the Guard members from meeting annual training requirements, or interfere with the Guard's ability to respond to domestic emergencies. Thank you.
Representative Barker.
Mr. Speaker, members of the body, I stand up today not really knowing what I'm going to say. There's so much that's been said. Accusations not just in this chamber, but accusations outside of this chamber on this particular bill, and it saddens me that that's what this debate has become about. This, just quite simply from the top, I view as an unconstitutional bill. There are certainly other unconstitutional bills that we've heard, but I think that this is certainly the most reckless of those bills. I'm sympathetic to the concerns expressed by the sponsor. I would never impugn the character of the sponsor. I would never impugn the character of anyone that supports this bill like my character has been impugned, and like the character of anybody who opposes this bill has been impugned. I think it's unacceptable. It's beneath us. I think that we need to elevate this conversation and talk about the merits of this bill, acknowledging that there are issues. I understand that everybody's weary. I understand being weary of war. It reminds me of the interwar period in Europe. The French and the British were weary enough of war that they weren't willing to face aggression when it was needed. I'm not comparing any situation that we have right now to that. But to the sponsor who suggested that every war that we fought in the last 20 years was a war of choice and adventurism completely disregards 9/11. It completely disregards the blood and the sacrifice of very close friends, loved ones, who went to defend our freedoms and respond to the call when our nation was attacked on 9/11. Has it been too long that we forgot 9/11? Has it been so long that we forgot why we went and fought that conflict? I certainly hope not, because the consequences could be grave. So should we have gone to Afghanistan to defend our country, to defend this nation? Absolutely. I would do it again. Should we have gone to Iraq? In retrospect, probably not. But that's not a reason to pursue this unconstitutional approach to having better accountability at the national level. This unconstitutional bill cherry picks the Constitution. It completely disregards the fact that the founders have authorized the use of force as early as 1798 in a quasi-war against the French. It completely disregards the Supremacy Clause. This bill, quite simply, is based on the failed and unconstitutional notion of nullification. Let's not make a decision this important for emotion or based on political points. If we really want to do something about federal overreach, if we want to do something about foreign adventurism, whether real or perceived, let's do something constitutional. Let's invoke Article 5 Convention of States. Let's get a balanced budget amendment. It's really hard to go do things to overreach and pursue foreign adventurism without money. Let's make the federal government balance the budget. That's something positive that we could do if we really want to address this issue. But let's not do it like this. Vote no.
Majority Leader Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to start by remarking on what I've seen today. I've never seen a bill referral and never seen a scene like that before in all the time I've ever been here. I thought it was incredibly unprofessional. And I really didn't appreciate the opening either, by standing up here and having people get up here and impugn that we don't follow the Constitution because we don't all follow a bill. You know, this bill to me is, I can say a lot of bad words about this bill, but we can just start with the first one. This one is unconstitutional. We have a legal review note right here. It's pretty clear here in federal law that we don't get to go and take and try and overpower the ability of the president to call the military up to action. That's what this bill does. That's unconstitutional. Now that's one problem. Let's go to the second one. Look at this fiscal note. This fiscal note is disgusting. We're going to lose $132 million a year in federal funding for our military. Think about what our National Guard does. These are people that go out and fight fires. They're there in the middle of an emergency. When there's a flood, you call the National Guard. Now we want to strip all that away. How does that help the people of Montana? You know, I find this bill offensive on another level. This thing is a direct attack on the people I represent. Cascade County. Where's the Air National Guard? It's in Great Falls. This bill strips funding for all those airmen up the Air National Guard. Well, here's another one this is the one that really torques me. The Air National Guard provides $3 million for the fire station at the Great Falls Airport. So now if we lose this bill, or this bill goes through, we're not going to have any funding for the fire department. A plane crash is great. Or are we going to have to call the city up now because we don't have a fire department anymore at the airport? You know, I think the sponsor said the bill's dead if it goes down to approps. There's a good reason. It hurts the people of Montana. I don't think I've seen a bill ever come through the legislature that hurts the people of Montana more than this one. And I'm going to talk about the politics for a second. You know, this bill came last session, and the Adjutant General went and testified in the committee, and he said, this one defunds the Guard. And you know what? There was a PAC, and it took that language, and it put it on postcards, and now there's 2 representatives from Great Falls that are no longer with us anymore. This is bad politics. It's bad policy. This is a postcard vote. So if you're voting for it, you think it's a good idea, you're going to get the postcard vote. Because it's no different than saying I'm going to defund the police. That was not a winner for anybody to say we're going to defund the police. Defunding the National Guard is not a winner either. So I hope you give this a red button. No way you'd ever give this a green. With that, I sit down, Mr. Chair, Mr. President, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Millett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support this bill, and it's for one reason and one reason only, and it has to do with this thing I hold in my hand. It's called the Constitution of the United States. Article 1, Section 8. Congress has the power to declare war. Not the president, not the governor, nobody else. Congress does. Also in that section, it goes on to say, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Congress has that power. Now, there's some that will argue either way, the National Guard is the militia is not the National Guard. But it does say right in there, Congress has the power for calling forth. If you go over to Section 2, or Article 2, about the President, Article 2, Section 2, President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. When called into the service, who does the calling? Well, Congress does in Article 1, Section 8. I heard the argument that this is not an issue for the states. This is an issue for the Congress to deal with. Well, how's that worked out? Congress has not dealt with this. Congress has abused their authority, or actually they have not done their job. The president has abused this. Congress hasn't stood up to them and said, no, that's our job. Our job is to declare the war. Your job is to prosecute the war. So what are the states left to do? The only thing we can do, say no, put some restrictions on them. You know, we need to remember, folks, we, the states, even though Montana was not a state when the United States came into existence in 1789, we still have the full standing of a state at that time. And the states, plural, created the federal government. The federal government is a creature of the states. We have authority over the federal government, and it's time that we exercise that authority. How can we do that? Simple. We don't want our National Guard, we don't want our daughters, our sons, our friends, and our neighbors to go overseas in some undeclared war that we don't agree with, that there's not national consensus in. And this is the way that we do it. Now, I hear that there's some things about, well, we're going to lose all this money. Is that true? If you look at that fiscal note, look at the rebuttal, read it and understand it. There's no way, in my mind, there's no way that they're going to take any of that money away from us. That's a red herring, in my opinion. Also, I'd like to remind the body that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has said on the record multiple times that he supports Defend the Guard. He supports. Do you think somebody like that supports Defend the Guard is going to defund the Guard? I think not. And I submit to you that he won't. So we don't have anything to worry about that. So what's more important? Adherence to the Constitution and asserting our right as a state to demand the federal government formally declare war before sending our sons and our daughters, our friends and our neighbors to die in a foreign land?
1 minute.
Or a supposed loss of money that, if you read and understand the fiscal note rebuttal, is 100% false. But even if that were true, the question then becomes, do you stand with the Constitution or against the Constitution? Do you stand for states' rights or against states' rights? I ask you to choose the Constitution and choose states' rights. Vote yes on House Bill 404. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Beatty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So for the record, I stand for the Constitution. And for that reason, I oppose this bill. Now, I think a great case has been made here by others, and I'm not going to rehash that. I do respect the position that's been put forward by the proponents. I think they get their reading of the Constitution a bit blinkered. But I want to take a little bit different tack here. You know, the reality of war right now is, and this has been for decades, if not longer, is that war now is often not total war. We live in a world, a connected world, a world with the industrial base, with weaponry, that total war will lead you someplace that looks something like Europe in 1917, or Europe in 1945, or other places. Contemplate the notion of a declaration of war during the Cold War period, when we fought proxy wars in Korea, proxy wars in Vietnam. How is a declaration of war against our adversaries there going to work out for us? The reason we fought these proxy wars is because it was no longer viable to engage in total war. Matter of fact, the idea was to avoid total war. The next point I'll make is the United States military, since the end of the draft, the effective end of the draft, and since the end of the Cold War, which of course that's when peace broke out. I'm sorry to tell you all that human nature is such that peace will never break out. But let us just state that we have created a military that heavily relies on its reserve force and National Guard. That is by design. If we are going to attend to the national security environment that we find ourselves in today, we will be depending on deployment of the National Guard. As my friends in the National Guard have stated here, those people that have signed up to do this job have signed up knowing very well what they're in for and have the courage to go take care of it in order to attend to our national security needs. Our enemies, do I need to list them all? Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, not opponents, our enemies are sniffing out opportunities to see a lack of resolve in the United States of America. This is not quite like Munich in 1938, where Adolf Hitler sensed weakness in France and England, and where did that leave us? Devastation in Europe, the Holocaust. Our enemies are looking for signs of weakness. This bill is a sign of weakness. Vote no.
Representative Durham.
Mr. Chair, before I make that motion, I'd just like to remind us that we've been at war with poverty, we've been at war on drugs for all my lifetime, and yet in my lifetime we've lost ground on those issues, in part because we haven't devoted an effort towards it. I was pleased to hear that there was some discussion about Article 5 earlier, and this is actually the reason why I don't support Article 5 anymore, is that there are rules in the Constitution to keep us from rewriting that Constitution. Mr. Chair, I call for cloture.
Cloture is in order. Representatives, this is a 2/3 vote. Clerk, record the vote.
Mr. Chair, 49 representatives have voted aye, 47 have voted no.
Motion has failed. Back on the bill. Representative Byrne.
Mr. Speaker, first I rise to let everyone, this is a conscience vote. Everyone needs to vote how their conscience is going to lead them on this. I have a little different perspective. Most people don't know my prior life, my prior job. Spent over 30 years in the military. The last 14 was as a strategic war planner. And I was involved in the Balkans. And the National Guard unit state refused to send 2 companies to Bosnia. and the Army, the National Guard Bureau, and Army National Guard headquarters tried to punish them for it. Their congressional delegation stepped in, would not let them punish it. Now, the National Guard headquarters and NGB eventually took one of their units away to punish them, but they did it for readiness, under the guise of readiness, and gave it to another state, which they do restructuring all the time. So yes, there was a punishment, but their congressional delegation stepped in and stopped from touching anything else in that unit. So over the years, I saw many National Guard units deploy, return, what have you, but the piece of the federal side and the congressional side really disallowed them from being fiscally punished. Is there a challenge? Is there a threat? Is there an opportunity for some of the force structure to go away if the state of Montana refuses? Absolutely. How much? It will not be the whole thing. It would be minimal because congressional leadership does hold the purse strings. With that said, even if this goes into effect, the federal side has ways to deploy us, the Montana National Guard, into war zones even with this in place. They take you off, they mobilize you for training. Once you're out of this state doing training in Title 10, or if you're doing an alternative mission, backfilling one of the posts while they go to war, once you're on Title 10 doing those, they can move you any way you want in the state, and no matter what the Defend the Guard says, you're still going to war. You know, there's ways. It's a nice feeling up front, and it puts a message out there, but there's ways to get around it. Now, if they come right out and try and give you a pre-mo border for training for follow-on deployment, yes, this blocks that. Remember all the little engagements out there, the Granadas, the Panamas, the Haitis, Liberia, when we went to Liberia back in 2003. No National Guard. You did not have time to mobilize, train, and deploy. This specifically addresses large-scale operations, i.e. Afghanistan, Iraq. And remember, it took a long time to get any National Guard into Afghanistan because of the long lead-up time going into Iraq.
1 minute.
Yes, there was a whole lot of mobilization going on for the National Guard because the Department of Defense cannot go to war without the reserves, both Compo 2, National Guard, Air National Guard, Army National Guard, and Compo 3, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Reserves. So there's a long lead up, and in that time, Congress needs to start stepping up and addressing this if we are going to another major theater war to declare war. They should have done it for Afghanistan. Iraq's a different story. But with that, once again, vote your conscience. This is a hard bill, and let the chips fall where they may.
Representative Elvram, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise carefully, sort of, on this bill. I am in the National Guard. I drill this weekend, and I'm proud to do it and happy to do it. I've been in the National Guard for 9-10 years now, since leaving active duty back in 2014. And my concern with what I heard, especially in the opening, is describing service members somehow as victims, somehow that they're here to protect us from something we volunteer for every single day. What this bill is trying to do is politicize us and use service members as political pawns, and we're not. We volunteer each and every day to serve our communities and our nation. Now, mind you, the way the National Guard has been used over the last 20 years, through the conflicts we've been in, none of us have joined not knowing what we were signing up for. We know, and we're good with it. We're okay. We get home, we'd like some support. We'd like some help. But don't pity us for going, and don't pity us when we get home. To the appropriations piece as to the money, and that Congress has somehow not approved this, they approve it every time they make an appropriation. Each and every year, they continue to fund the National Guard, and we continue to deploy with that funding. They are approving it. It's called the National Defense Authorization Act. Each and every year, It is frankly absurd to think that Congress is not authorizing these. Now, I will go back. We did hear a lot of history. There have been 11 separate formal declarations of war during 5 different conflicts. The last one was in World War II. The scope of warfare has changed since World War II. We do have non-state actors. It is much different than when the Constitution was written. But to say that Congress has not authorized use of military force is, again, just not accurate or true. They have the power and the purse strings. They do. If they did not want the National Guard to go, that funding would cease. Now, what we've been told is this isn't going to result in any defunding of the National Guard. The drill that I have this weekend is in a brand new $34 million facility down in Butte, built by local contractors, built by local engineers, filled with soldiers who live in your communities. The funding for your National Guard, if you're no longer willing to let us do our duty and deploy when we are asked to with lawful orders from the President of the United States, that funding and our usefulness to those folks sending the money to this state is going to cease. And again, I'll use the word absurd because it's absurd to think they're continually going to give the money to us. Now, I'm tracking that most folks don't understand how that money flows through the federal system. It goes through NGB and then it comes down to the state. But if one single state stands up and says, no, 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 we're going to protect our guys, we don't want them to go to this one, that money is going to be diverted to other states. Those resources, those helicopters, they're all going to go to states that are willing to do their duty. Let's talk about that duty and what it means and what those resources do here in the state. I've been activated on state active duty orders to fight fire on hand crews. I've done that and was happy to do that. On both sides of the aisle, this should be pertinent. Like, this should make sense. If you saw what we did during COVID, when you volunteer, there are no politics. Like, you volunteer to follow orders. We responded during COVID. The National Guard did that because that's what the orders came down and it was the right thing to do. We also, on the other side of the aisle, we respond to protest. We're there for those too. Our political ideology goes out the window because we are doing our duty. I'm going to end with what I started with. No one who volunteers to serve is a victim or needs your pity or needs you to protect them. We all volunteer to serve. We've been doing it for the last 20 years during all these different conflicts. Anyone who's still in is willing to continue to keep going. And if they're not, they're free to leave. This is America.
Representative Maddox.
Call for cloture.
That motion is out of order. You need 2 proponents and 2 opponents. Representative Manis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the moment, question for the sponsor.
I yield.
Good sponsor. In my study and kind of reading on this, trying to figure this thing out for myself, a lot of the argument that I heard and all, and this is a little different than what we've been talking about. National Guard a lot of times will go overseas out of the country for non-combat, so not declaration of wars. And so if my question involves that, looking at Section 3, Montana National Guard, any member of the National Guard may not be released from the state into federal duty, including active duty combat, unless Congress has passed an official declaration of war or be taken an action. Could you speak and answer that question on if our Guard, were this to pass, still be able to go out of country, training, road building, whatever else they do besides war?
Absolutely. Mr. Speaker, I think if we were to look down on the new section 421, nothing in sections 1 through 4 limits or restricts the governor's authority under Title 32, and then it includes those things that we talked about before: training and readiness, responding, training and readiness within the United States or its territories or in friendly foreign countries, et cetera, et cetera. I think that should probably answer your concerns there. And let's see, there was something else I was thinking about. Representative, does that answer your question?
Yes, follow up.
Follow up? Does the sponsor continue to yield?
I do.
Okay, so with this bill, we're trying to focus on combat and whether they can go for that. So I guess I'm just narrowing down the bill. We need to focus on that aspect of it, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising more on an integrity issue than anything else. I know you think I'm dumber than a post, and that's fine. But I can think for myself, and if you think for 1 minute that because a general came and talked to me, I can't make up my mind, I feel bad for you. As far as the Energy Committee going to get information, that was my idea. That wasn't something that General Ronick brought before me. And in fact, I asked him not to provide helicopter rides when we went. I wanted information for the committee so that they could make good decisions. That was the only thing I was after. I didn't even go on the helicopter that time. And so I want you to understand, I can think for myself, and I'm not sacrificing my integrity. I have my own beliefs. Thank you.
Representative Jay Hinkle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker. It was referenced that there was a mailer sent out that was called Defund the Guard. And I just want to add that that mailer sent out was despicable and grossly
Representative, let's keep it to the bill.
I will. And grossly misrepresented this
Representative, let's keep it to the bill.
Bill and those who voted for it. On the basis of Defund the Guard, argument is that the National Guard Bureau will reallocate funding from the Montana to other states. However, this has faulty key assumptions. Once one looks closely at the larger picture of Title 32, which governs the National Guard, which Title 32 says declared war. It doesn't say asked to deploy. It says declared war. The faulty case is that asking the federal government to comply with the Constitution and its obligations for the federalizing National Guard forces means that the Guard will somehow be less ready. Less ready plainly means that they are unable to deploy to war should a legitimate war be debated and declared by Congress. Less ready does not mean willing to fly to combat zones without a declaration of war. At this point, opponents have said, but the Supremacy Clause, as though the Supremacy Clause placed a government bureau in torturous reading of the federal code above the Constitution. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Only laws in compliance with the Constitution are legitimate, and only agency actions that align with the Constitution are legal. Federal law supersedes state law, but federal bureaucracies deciding on the contrary or contradictory readings of the federal code do not. It was brought up that our nation has strayed largely from the Constitution. If they hadn't, we wouldn't be in over $30 trillion in debt. And my goal, and with this bill and other bills, is to bring our nation together again under that Constitution. Please vote green to protect our Montana sons and daughters against undeclared and unconstitutional wars. Thank you.
Minority Leader Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be voting no on this bill, and I call for cloture.
That motion is in order. Members, this is a 2/3 vote. Clerk will record the vote.
Mr. Chair, 92 representatives have voted aye, 4 have voted no.
Motion is passed. Would the sponsor like to close?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, of course I would. So earlier on, we talked about, had a lot of people saying, well, I don't know where to start. Well, I don't either. I've got a page of scribbled notes. Just a few things to finish out. Let's be clear. I don't pity the National Guard. I honor them. There's no question about it. That's why I'm trying to protect them from unconstitutional wars. You know, we heard all kinds of references to the Constitution, but only on the proponent side. The references that were made were general, not specific. Remember that. If there had been constitutional concerns, we would have had specific ones that were mentioned. You know, there was some sadness that was expressed. Yeah, I get it. 6,000 American soldiers died in the global war on terror. Yeah, I feel that too. That's pretty sad. Nothing happens on this floor can compare to that. They didn't have to go. You know, 911 was invoked. Okay, let's talk about 911. You guys know this history. The Taliban, they offered to give up Osama bin Laden. And now, the United States is supporting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, in Syria. Do you really think that Congress wouldn't have given the president a declaration of war after 9/11? Do you really think that? And why not? Let's make it legal. We went all the way back to 1798, war against the French. Well, I didn't need a declaration of war because that was a defensive war. You don't need a declaration for a defensive war. We heard some people disturbed about what went on here. And I'll admit, and I'll ask forgiveness, there's no excuse that my emotions run away from me because I believe so strongly in this. You know, I talk to veterans all the time. I've worked with them on this bill and some other issues. I know quite a few people who are trying to keep veterans from committing suicide who have been through this conflict. So do you blame me for trying to bring this bill? 22 a day, at least. Yeah, disturbing. You know what's disturbing to me? Sending men and women to their deaths without a constitutional declaration of war. That's disturbing to me. And I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not going to apologize for feeling so strongly about that. National security was invoked. Does national security demand that we abandon the Constitution?
One minute.
You and I swore an oath to support the Constitution, not federal funding. The veterans I work with started this movement, this Defend the Guard movement. I think we should listen to them. And if the representative in seat 80 would forgive me, I did get carried away. No excuses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question now arises on the motion of Representative Deming that when this committee does rise and report after having had under consideration House Bill 404, it recommend the same do pass. All those in favor vote aye. All those opposed vote no. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to? Are there any proxies?
Mr. Chair, Representative Crow votes no.
Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? If not, the clerk will record the vote.
Mr. Chair, 41 representatives have voted aye, 58 have voted no.
House Bill 404 has failed to pass second reading. The House will stand at ease for 1 minute.